unsolved mystery kind of theme that we've been going on. And if you're new here, I have done true crime videos for a very, very long time, years. I used to cover really sometimes gruesome, hard-hitting true crime cases that were quite disturbing. I look back sometimes and I'm like, I researched that willingly. So these days I still do true crime every once in a while, once a month, once every 2 months, but the cases are a little bit more, I don't want to say tame because they still are crimes, but they are not as gruesome, they are not as graphic, and not as disturbing. It's a little bit more at my speed. So if you are looking for something to kind of pique your interest and you know, get your mind going while you're also winding down, but you don't want anything too graphic, hopefully that you will appreciate this. So anyway, that was a long-winded intro, but today I wanted to do a case very similar. If you've been around my channel for a while, you might remember I covered the case of the Papin sisters. I believe that took place in the 1930s, and it's just very interesting, obviously, because the world was much different then than it is now, obviously, and so it's just very interesting to me to hear about these things that happened way back then. And so when I was looking up, I'm sorry, my nose is so itchy, it's probably cat hair. When I was looking up true crime cases, I found one from the 1950s that I thought was very interesting, and it actually has very similar themes to the Papin sisters in that it features two people who have a very intense bond that causes a lot of not so great things to occur. So I am just going to get into it, shall we? I have my notes here, that's why I keep looking down. I'm not gonna, it's my big iPad, so I'm not gonna lift it, but I have my notes right here to my left, and we're just going to go through it. Okay, so this case is the Parker-Hulme murder case, and it involves two young girls and that relationship that I was talking about, that kind of relationship. Two young girls that were extremely close friends. This case was also interesting because I usually cover a lot of cases that happened in the United States. This one took place in New Zealand, more specifically in Christchurch, New Zealand, on June 22nd, 1954. That was what, 70 years ago, 71 years ago. So those two girls, their names are Pauline Parker and Juliet Hulme. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. At the time of the murder, Pauline was 16 and Juliet was 15, so they were very young. And the woman who unfortunately lost her life was Pauline's mother. Her name was Honora Mary Reaper, also known as Honora Mary Parker. We'll get into why there are two names. So let's get into the background of the girls. So Pauline was born in New Zealand on May 26, 1939. She came from a working class background, so her parents were gardeners and part-time staff at a nearby university, the University of Canterbury. And so her mother and her father's name was Herbert Reaper, they were living together, but it came out later, actually during the trial and everything, that they were not actually legally married. So that's why they changed her name, or referred to her by her maiden name, which is Parker, and later Pauline as well. So they were employed by this university. Now Juliet, on the other hand, was born in London on October 28th, 1938, and she immigrated to New Zealand with her parents in 1948, so when she was only 10 years old. Her father's name is Henry, and Henry was a physicist who became a senior official at the University of Canterbury. And so the university then set Juliet's family up with housing. So both families were employed by the university and lived nearby. Now, as a result, both girls attended the Christchurch Girls' High School, and they bonded on very similar things that they were going through in life. They were both diagnosed with certain illnesses that affected the way that they lived. So I'm going to try to the best I can, but I have my notes as to what each condition is because I had never heard of them before. So Pauline had osteomyelitis. We're gonna go with that. And that is a bone infection that is typically caused by a bacteria or other germs, and that can spread through the blood and infect your tissue. So it causes pain, swelling, redness, difficulty moving in the affected areas. Juliet had tuberculosis, which is a serious infection that generally affects your lungs. That one I had heard of. And some people call it white death. And so the girls bonded over these illnesses and they became friends, and then as time went on they got really close, and as they grew closer they formed this elaborate fantasy life together that you can only assume they did that to kind of escape what they were going through. So they wrote plays, they wrote books and stories that were centered in this fantasy world that they had created, and they grew so close and spent so much time together that their families wondered if they were interested in each other romantically, if that's what was happening behind the scenes. And now remember, this is the 1950s, so at that time homosexuality was not accepted, and in my notes here I read and said that at the time it was considered like a mental illness at the time, so it was not accepted at all. But regardless, both families, they didn't stop the girls from seeing each other. It was just something that they were wondering if that was happening, and they were a little concerned about it. So Pauline was welcomed by Juliet's family very much. She had sleepovers, they invited her on vacations, and when Pauline would leave, Juliet would almost become ill. She would become so upset when she was alone, even though she wasn't alone. She had her parents, but she felt alone, and she would get so worked up that she would make herself sick because she missed Pauline. So that just goes to show you, I guess they relied on each other so much that fantasy world probably started to feel like their reality, and so they were very dependent on each other. So now in this fantasy world, they invented their own personal religion, and it centered around their own ideas of morality. They rejected Christianity. They came up with their own saints to worship. They envisioned a parallel dimension that they called the fourth world, which was basically their idea of heaven, and they believed that they could already access heaven even though they were not dead. They were alive, but they could still have access to it occasionally in moments of what they called spiritual enlightenment. And according to Pauline, they had already achieved this spiritual enlightenment because of their friendship. I don't know if that means they were just so close and had such a special bond that it brought them to that spiritual enlightenment, but they believed that they had access to this heaven. What that looked like when they were hanging out together in each other's rooms, we can only imagine, but very interesting. Now, in previous years, Pauline had always been invited to Juliet's family's place for summer holidays and vacations, but in the year 1953, she was not invited for the first time. At that same time, certain things were happening at the university with leadership and stuff that caused Juliet's father to resign from his high position at the university. At the same time, Juliet's mother, it was founded that she was having an affair. It was discovered that she was having an extramarital affair. So there was a lot going on for Juliet's family. So the family planned on returning to England, but it was decided that Juliet actually would go live with family in South Africa, and her parents would go back to England. And they said this was for her health. Both girls were very upset about their upcoming separation, right? They could not live without each other. So they decided, okay, Pauline's gonna go to South Africa too. So they thought that Juliet's parents, because they were so, inclusive and so inviting of Pauline all the time, they thought that Juliet's parents were gonna be okay with it, but they knew that Pauline's mother would not be. She was not as lenient. So they thought Hollywood or New York City, where they believed they would publish their writing and their books and then work in film. That was their long-term plan. So, on June 22nd, in 1954, the girls had afternoon tea with Pauline's mother, Honora, in a tea kiosk in Victoria Park, Christchurch. So I'm assuming, I'm picturing like a cafe. After their meal, they walked through a wooded area, kind of like a little park area. They only walked, it says, 430 feet down a path where they unalived her with a half of a brick that they put in old pantyhose, and they beat her over the head. Afterwards, they ran back to the cafe and they found the owners named Agnes and Kenneth Ritchie, and they told them that she had fallen and hit her head and, accidentally died. And so, of course, they were like, oh my goodness. They ran out, they found her. Police very quickly discovered the murder weapon, and their story of her accidental death very quickly fell apart. Now, the trial. During the trial, both Pauline and her mother were referred to with their last name Parker, like I mentioned before, because her parents were never legally married. And there was a lot of speculation about the case. People believed that the girls were romantically involved. They believed that they were just so mentally ill that they could do something like this. So a lot of eyes on this case at the time. Now, on August 28th, 1954, they were convicted, but because they were both too young for the death penalty, this part confuses me, they only did 5 years. I don't know if it was just different back then, or if it was because they were young, they were minors. Probably that's the only thing I can think of. They only spent 5 years in prison. It was rumored at the time that they were released on the condition that they would never contact each other again, but the Secretary of Justice at the time, Sam Barnett, he told the journalists and everybody that was not true. That's not a true thing. So Juliet's release was unconditional, and she immediately joined her father in Italy. He was in Italy at the time, where Pauline was placed on, Juliet went to visit her father in Italy, stayed there with him, and Pauline was placed on 6 months parole in New Zealand after she left the country. I don't know if she got more, because maybe she actually did it, or maybe because it was her mother, I don't know. But she had 6 months of parole. Now, Pauline, after her release, was given a brand new identity, new name. Hilary Nathan was her name. And she spent some time in New Zealand under very close surveillance. And then eventually she was allowed to leave the country, and she went to England. I thought, she went to England because that's where maybe she thought Juliet was gonna go. I think that's very interesting. But they never, to my knowledge, they never did life together again. They were never friends again, I don't think. And there in England, she eventually ran a children's horseback riding school. As an adult, she became a devout Roman Catholic. She never spoke to the press, but she did express strong remorse, and in 1996, the year I was born, 29 years ago, she released a statement through her sister about what happened. And it says her sister further stated that, quote, Pauline committed the most terrible crime and has spent 40 years repaying it by keeping away from people and doing her own little thing. After it happened, she was very sorry about it. It took her 5 years to realize what she had done. It took her 5 years. Crazy. Oh, Luna's awake. As for Juliet, after her release from prison, she spent time in England, and the United States, and later settled in Scotland and became a successful historical detective under her new name, Anne Perry. She had been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints since about 1968. Until 1994, it was not well known that Perry was Juliet. In March of 2006, Juliet stated that while her relationship with Parker was obsessive, they were not romantically involved. So it's like they both came to later in life. Very, very interesting. And then Juliet actually died on April 10th, 2023 at the age of 84. Now, from my research, I saw that there were movies and books made about this. The films, Heavenly Creatures, Reflections of the Past, and Remake. Never heard of any of them. And then books based on them, The Evil Friendship, Harriet Said, ... So Brilliantly Clever, and These Violent Delights. Never heard of any of them, but it's just very, very interesting, scary, and just strange. But it just goes to show you how when people are like, well, I don't know, because it seems like, in my opinion, in order to do something like that, there has to be something not working correctly, unless you're in such a place of desperation. And then if you have a partner in crime telling you, yeah, that's a good idea, and you're also like 15, 16, you know, it's just like the recipe for a perfect recipe for a disaster. So anyway, that is the case for today. I wish there were more details about this case, I really do, but when you go into the past and you find cases from 70, 80 years ago, it's harder to find information. But I did find some pictures, and hopefully you saw it, put them throughout the video. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for watching,